Hey everyone, so I'm Jack Jacobs and I'm very excited this week to be launching Beaconsfield. It's a podcast about institutional reform and cultural renewal. I'm interested in that question of how we keep our institutions alive and healthy in times of crisis and change. And I can't think of anyone better to be launching this podcast with than Elizabeth Broderick. Ayo, how you doing, Liz?
Good. Thanks very much, Jack. And thanks for inviting me on for the launch. I feel very privileged.
I'm privileged. And so to give everyone a bit of context about the incredible things you do, Elizabeth Broderick AO is the current UN Special Rapporteur for Women, and she's an independent expert that works with the UN on women's issues. She's Australia's ex-Sex Discrimination Commissioner and has been a forthright leader in cultural change throughout a variety of projects in Australia. And we're really lucky to have her come onto the show today to speak particularly about gender equality and the way we can kind of navigate the responsibilities and values of that area. So Liz, let's start off talking about cultural renewal then. So having worked with several organisational cultures over the last few years, sporting teams, the AFP, the ADF, University Administration, and the United Nations, how is it that you think leaders in gender equality can affect ongoing, lasting cultural change? What are your big tips? Let's start off general here.
Yeah, that's a really big question, actually, Jack. But I suppose if I start with looking at the attributes of leaders that are leading major transformation, and particularly in the areas of gender equality, what is it that they have in common? So the ones that are doing it best, they have immense courage. Now, we mightn't see courage in the sense of, actually going into a physical battle, but they have the courage to stand up and take often a view which is not necessarily a popular view. So they have courage, and I can give a few examples of that as we go along. They have an unshakable commitment to the change they're trying to lead. So it goes to the core of who they are. It's not just an add-on. And in the way they act, what they say, what they prioritize, and what they measure, that commitment is evident to everyone. So I think that's important. The other thing is that they're vulnerable. They often say, look, I don't know what the answer is, but maybe we could try this, or let's talk about what's messy and sad. And I'm going to start by telling you my own story. So that ability to be vulnerable, which you wouldn't imagine in the military or even in sport, which is highly competitive, but the ones that are doing it best are deeply vulnerable. And the other attribute I'd say is they have a strong authenticity. I mean, what you see is actually who they are. That they do what they say. They're not pretending to be something that they're not. So that deep authenticity, empathy, humility, and not only that, perseverance, because change doesn't come in one giant leap. It comes in, thousands and thousands of small steps. I call it, I talk about it as adding to, adding more, continuing. It's each of those steps, and they don't give up, in the first gale. They just course correct, and then they come back and keep on pushing forward in a deeply human way. So the ones that are leading transformative change, whether they be male or female, that's the attributes of those strong leaders.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Liz, because I think this relationship between the leadership and the community you're trying to change is a really interesting one. So I'm guessing that the reason you've listed these particular values is that they are what the leader needs to speak to the community or the institution in a way where they're going to actually listen to what's being said. I was wondering if you could expand a bit upon how we speak to communities in a way that is actually going to motivate them to get around the change, particularly when they're unwilling, resistant to change, because human beings tend to be conservative, I think, and averse to wanting to change their ways of life. How can a leader use those values that you've just listed there to speak to people in a way that actually gets them involved in their own change?
You're right, because if you just roll up and demand change, I can tell you nothing will shift. And I've seen so often, people go in, they have no ability to recognize what exists today. They just run in with a strong reform agenda and say, listen, this is what we're doing, everyone get on board. And to be honest, you might as well not bother. And not only that, I think it goes to the heart of respect, because when I go in and I have no recognition of the parts of the culture or the organization or whatever it is you're trying to change that are good today, then I don't acknowledge the contribution that already exists. So for me, as a leader of change, it's about recognizing those things which exist today, which probably took years and years to develop and build, and someone cared enough to step up and speak. And I recognize what's good and what should be protected and guarded as we move forward. And I thank people for their contribution and recognition. But having said all that, you know, what we know is that organizations, just like every one of us, needs to evolve to stay relevant, to actually deliver impact. So having recognized the historical contribution of individuals, I hope to show them a different future. And the way I think that I do that is engaging in many, many conversations, Jack. So when I step up and engage in a conversation with you about change, part of it will be putting maybe some hard data to you, stuff that'll engage your mind, but equally it'll be telling you the stories of the adverse impact of what exists today, so that you can see that human suffering is happening on our watch, and I can engage through your heart to get you to step up and do something differently. And I think there's a couple of practices which I find really useful when I do this work. The first thing is quite profound, but it is very simple. And that is that when I engage with people about a conversation about change, I never assume that those who hold views contrary to mine actually come with ill intent. Because I think when you assume that, you actually shut down any chance of a meaningful conversation which will deliver any impact. You instantly cut yourself off from understanding why someone holds the views that they do. Now, I may not agree with your view, and you may not agree with mine, but what I can't challenge you on, and what I'm trying to discover in these conversations, is what are the forces and influences that have shaped you to hold that view? Because if I can do that, then maybe we can find some common ground and a bridge of understanding. And just to give you one example of that, I'm part of a small group of the working group, and each of its members have different views. And if we took something as, you know, provocative as, say, sex work, it's an area that we need to navigate in terms of what are the human rights of sex workers. They're some of the most vulnerable in our communities. There'll be a range of views in the group about that. So we'll have some, potentially like me, who believe that, well, you know, often sex work is not necessarily a choice, but to the extent that women engage in sex work, or indeed men, that it should be well regulated, it shouldn't be exploited, there should be no violence. So I'll have that type of view. Whereas one of the others in the group she's what they call an abolitionist. Her view is that sex work should be obliterated from the face of the earth. And whilst I disagree with her view, what I've been able to do is understand what are the influences and forces that shaped her to hold that view. And I know from discussions with her now, she holds that view because she's deeply connected to Indigenous women in her region of the world. And Indigenous women and many believe that the body is sacred. So the idea that I would offer it up to sex work is such an anathema that's why she holds those views. But I think, not assuming ill intent, she doesn't come with any ill intent at all. She just comes with a different view, and it's incumbent on me to understand why it is that she holds that view. So that's one of the practices I use. The second practice, which I find really useful, is I ask myself, what am I troubled about in my own point of view? And what do I see as attractive or positive in your point of view? And then if I can offer up my dilemma in the hope of finding some common ground, and not only that, I'm being vulnerable. I'm acknowledging that there's a chink in my argument, and I'm willing to look to find a way forward that we may not have imagined before. I
Mm.
think that's a useful technique as well. So those two techniques, I think, are important in those change discussions.
That's incredibly
To
interesting. So
recognize.
it's about, I mean, all of that stems from listening, doesn't it? It's about having the vulnerability to open up, acknowledge that your own views have their own fragility, and then to try and share those with others in a way that kind of honors their dignity. Hey, and I
Yeah.
think, yeah, what I've always thought about, a reason for why your work in gender equality is so compelling is that you're very adamant about involving men in gender equality. So it's been 10 years or so, I think, since you set up the Male Champions of Change strategy. So if you could just speak a bit about what that is, and then just a follow-up question on that. In that 10 years, do you think men have stepped up beside women in Australia, at least on gender equality? Have we been able to find common ground that in 2010 or 2009 to you seems so far away? Or have things not changed? Are there still things we need to do? So if you could just tie those incredible comments you made about listening and empathy into the Male Champions of Change work and male involvement, I'd be really interested to hear what you think is the link up there.
Yeah, thanks, Jack.
Mm.
Male Champions of Change came about probably about 10 years ago now. So I'd been the Sex Discrimination Commissioner for about 2 years. And to be honest, when I went into that role, I came with what I now understand is a pretty limited view, but I believe fundamentally that this was a women's issue for women to solve. I didn't see it as necessarily a key economic and social issue in the way that I do today. And I also believe that this was women's business. It was the collective action of women that had got women the right to vote, the right to work and care, the right to live free from violence, the right to pay equality. All those things largely came about in most of the nations of the world, including here in Australia, because women, and indeed, probably I will never know, several generations back, cared enough to step up and start advocating and demanding these rights. And for that, to be honest, I'll be eternally grateful. So I figured, well, I'll just be part of a continuation of that picture. I'll mobilize all my networks of women and we'll move ahead in that regard. But when I sat down to actually think about it, I started to realize actually that's quite an illogical approach, because the fact is, in most nations of the world, women don't hold the levers of power. They do a little bit, but largely the levers of power are held by men. So if we want to create change, we need powerful, decent men stepping up beside women, not speaking for them, not rescuing them, but stepping up beside them and taking equal accountability and responsibility for change. And that was really the birth of the Male Champions of Change organisation, a recognition that without powerful, decent men, good, decent men who are connected with all of us in our lives, that if we can't engage men to work with us in a really collaborative and co-creative way, we weren't going to shift the picture of gender equality, because gender equality is essentially about the redistribution of power in nations. It's about the redistribution of power in organizations, and indeed right back in the family, Jack. It starts right back in the family. And so often I meet young girls who, often because they have parents who believe that gender equality benefits everyone. This is not a zero-sum game where women win and men lose. Not at all. All the research shows that actually in more gender equal families, there's more economic resilience. So for example, in this period of COVID-19, if the father loses his job, then the mother or the other person in the relationship, they will more likely have employment. So you've got two incomes. So if one loses their job, the family won't be thrown into poverty. So there's so many ways that gender equality builds resilience, not just in families, but in organizations as well. What we know is those organizations with greater levels of gender diversity, particularly at senior levels, actually perform better. It's not necessarily a causal relationship, but it is highly correlated. And similarly, and I've just been returned 6 months or so ago from Greece, looking at the engagement of women in their labour market. The reason they're doing that is they want to rebuild their economy after years of austerity, and the bringing women back into the workforce is absolutely critical. So those things are really at the heart of a Male Champions of Change strategy. As one of our Male Champions of Change says, he said, look, men invented the system. Men largely run the system. Men
Mm,
need to step up with women and shift the system. And
yes.
that's really what Male Champions of Change is about.
That's incredibly interesting. And I think, I mean, an underdeveloped question that I find really interesting is that I think that being involved in gender equality for the sake of respecting the values involved in it is actually good for men. It's good for
Mm.
men at a deep personal level. It's good for the way they relate to the women in their lives, the way they relate to each other. Do you think that there's something deeper in being involved in gender equality work as a man for, you know, the sake of your soul almost? Is there something really good in it for men to be involved in it? You know what I mean, what I'm getting
Yeah.
at? Yeah,
Yeah,
what do you think about
I
that?
couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more, Jack, because at the heart of this is shared humanity.
Yeah.
And,
Mm,
I often say, men in organizations might say, well, why should we care? And I just
mm,
say to them, look, are you happy to work in an organization where 50% of the talent will never have the same opportunity to thrive that you will never be paid the same for doing comparable work that you are? Is that the organization you're happy to be part of as it's happening under your watch? And I think once you start to put it in a human context, people say, no, actually, I'm a better person for being engaged in gender equality. Similarly, with the issues around the sharing of care. So,
mm,
the sharing of paid and unpaid work between men and women. I mean, the idea that my mother would live in poverty because she chose to care for me rather than be actively engaged in paid work, because that was not an option for her. It was a binary choice. Either I'm in paid work or I'm caring for my family. And that's still a binary choice in many, many
mm,
nations of the world. The idea that she would live in poverty because she chose to care for me, it's such an anathema. I
mm,
think that anything that we can
mm,
do, men and women together, boys and girls together, that will ensure that those people who choose to care are equally recognised with those who choose to be
mm,
engaged in paid work. Because at the end of the day, it's all work. That's the world I want to inhabit. In fact, I want to inhabit a world where care sits front and centre
mm,
of society's purpose. And when I look at it, just even going through these deeply unsettling times at the minute, it's care for community, care for sick people, care for relatives and older
mm.
people. It's all that caring work, care for children. That's what's sustaining this nation as we move through the COVID
Yeah.
pandemic. So let's start recognizing that, and gender equality is a great way to recognize that.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I mean, let's talk about COVID a bit more, about the impacts of COVID on gender equality and the role that gender equality might play as an ethos moving out of this, however long it might take. On a darker note, I mean, we've seen quite a few statistics coming out over the last few weeks concerning the rise in domestic violence service engagements during this lockdown. So that was probably one of the unexpected major problems of this crisis, but one that we do need to deal with. I mean, just today, according to an SMH article by Lucy Cormack, on a good note,
Mm.
May 26th, 2020, it's been announced that around $21 million or more is going to
Mm.
come out and go into domestic violence services in New South Wales. That's great. But do you think that the problem is being created by the crisis or exacerbated by the crisis, or was it there before? And if it was there before, how has this domestic violence problem changed because of the crisis? And what can we do
Mm.
about it? Because it's very serious.
You're absolutely right. It's a great shame on our nation. And it
Mm,
was absolutely there before the crisis. Prior to the crisis, more than one woman a week was
mm,
murdered by her intimate partner.
yeah.
And we know globally, if I look at this global picture, around 980 million women are either today living in an intimate relationship characterized by violence or have recently done so. Actually, that's going into COVID. Now, what we know from some of the
Mm,
responses to COVID is where families are in a series of lockdowns or quarantine or isolation or whatever, where their ability to reach out to services is limited. But not only that, the tensions in the home, can become exacerbated, particularly with financial stress and everything else.
mm,
And that means that often women who might have in the past had some access to service or help have not been able to do that during the lockdown. And what we saw, and if I just start by Hubei province, where Wuhan is, of course, they had a 300% uplift in the number of domestic violence reports. Italy, similarly, many other nations. And I know here in Australia, and if I look at just one state, New South Wales, the New South Wales Police Commissioner says quite rightly, there hasn't been an increase in calls. But when you look at and speak to the heads of domestic violence agencies and NGOs, there's definitely a significant uplift, up to about 25% in the number of online inquiries and requests for help. So the fact is, if you're locked down with your abuser, you are not going to pick up the phone and ring the police. That's the last thing you're going to be able to do. You may be able to go online at some stage and try and ask for help that way. So what we're seeing is an escalation in domestic and family violence. The good news, actually, Jack, here in Australia is probably of all the nations in the world, we are the most advanced in workplace responses to domestic violence. I mean, the union movement has been a really strong agent of change in that as well. And what I know from my Male Champions of Change CEOs is that many of them are across this issue. Every one of them will have a domestic violence policy, and they have been arranging alternative accommodation for women. They have been deeming women to be essential office workers where that woman's reached out to them. And they're actively looking out for the issues of domestic and family violence. Yeah. But at the heart of this issue is gender inequality. I mean, domestic violence is all about power and control, and it's more prevalent in a less gender equal world.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's really important. What stood out to me from that is how you're talking about this integrated approach, that corporations, unions, these kinds of organizational communities might actually be the best place to respond to this social, intractable issue. What do you think governments can do? So other than funding, other than the kind of basic material stuff that needs to happen, like the great news that we've heard today about the new funding, what can governments do in terms of value, in terms of telling new stories, in terms of, enhancing what the corporations and the unions are trying to do? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think government has a critical role. I mean, if we look at the international conventions, they bind governments. I mean, it's government's responsibility to keep women safe in this nation. That's what they signed on to when they signed the convention. So they have a large part to play. As you said, part of that is in funding frontline organisations. But I think government actually keeping this issue high on the government's agenda, on the nation's agenda, I think the fact that government ministers and those who are senior, not just ministers, but in our bureaucracy also, that they actually promote behaviours of non-violence, of respect, of inclusion. And in a sense, that's been part of the debates about the way question time and other, Senate estimates and those types of formal, systems work in our government. Are they ones that are sending a message about respect? And there'd be many who argue that that's not the case. So I think it's incumbent on those who lead this nation to act in deeply respectful and non-violent. And I include in violence, it's not just physical violence, it's verbal violence, it's psychological abuse.
Yes.
I mean, if we look at domestic and family violence, it also includes economic abuse, cultural abuse, not being able to practice your culture and beliefs, and of course, sexual violence. So it's quite wide, but what we need to be doing is looking to our leaders as role models in this regard. And I have to say, looking across the world today, it's pretty grim to see how some leaders are actually stepping up or not, and the behaviours that are being adopted in relation to building respect and social cohesion in nations.
So it's really about value promotion in a really steadfast kind of integrity-driven way, isn't it? So I wanted to ask you a bit more about your role in the UN. So you're working in this global environment. You've spoken about how you're working with other people in the working group who might not have the same views or attitudes or approaches to gender equality that you have. What about the global perspective? has changed the way that you view government action, that you view organizational cultural change in Australia? Is there, being in Greece, being all around the world, what are some cool stories or insights you've got to do with your new global role?
Yeah, it's an interesting global role. So just to give you a bit of a thumbnail sketch about what it is, it's essentially, I have a number of roles. One is to lead the country visits. So to look at how nations are treating women and girls, and then to make recommendations as to how to lift their status. And that's why I was in Greece and in the Greek refugee camps, particularly on the Greek islands. And some of the things that I'm bearing witness to there were really, to be honest, just deeply traumatizing for individuals and for those who bear witness as well. So that's one role. The other is to actually write official communications to the heads of nations, drawing to their attention human rights violations that are happening, particularly against women and girls. And the third thing is to really look at strong thematic areas, such as, say, women's rights in the changing world of work. So consult all across the world and see what a truly global picture looks like, and particularly at this time of change. So, I mean, in terms of how the communication needs to differ, because most of my communications at that level, I'm communicating with human rights defenders from every part of the world. I mean, these are individuals who will go to jail for standing up and saying, I don't have personal protective equipment. So you'll lose your job. You might even go to jail. You'll be targeted as a contagion, all those types of things at the minute. Just to give you another example, we were recently in contact with a group of women in Cambodia who were most women in Cambodia, many nations in Southeast Asia will work in the informal economy. So they were street vendors. This young woman was selling clothes. And once you go into lockdown, you can't be in a public space selling your wares. So she decided to become a digital entrepreneur. She started posing with her clothes on her Facebook page and trying to sell clothes that way. This is about feeding herself and her family and everything else. And actually the Prime Minister came out and said, well, there were women in Cambodia who were bringing into disrepute and affecting the moral fabric of Cambodia by, wearing clothes on Facebook. And the net result of that was that the group of policemen came around, took her out of her house, and she was imprisoned. So these my engagement with human rights defenders is very much at a human level. So I keep those same techniques when I meet with the heads of nation states, as I do or their representatives, their permanent representatives, as I do regularly in Geneva and New York. I try to bring in the voices of the people that I've met. Because those, we talk a lot in policies and resolutions and what I call very kind of particular language, the language of modalities and the United Nations and whatever. But at the heart of it, if you can cut through with a strong human voice, you can actually engage that permanent representative or leader as a human being first and a leader second. And my view is that when you do that, you'll have a much greater ability to cut through and together work out different solutions.
So you're taking the story-driven approach of organizational change that you practice in Australia and developed here to that global level. Have you got any examples of where that's worked particularly well at a global level, even in just connecting with women, who are really the most important player in this, women on the ground who are experiencing this? Have you got any particularly moving moments?
Well, there's so many moving moments because I'm the keeper of a million stories. But just to give you some impact of that, the working group did a country visit to an African nation in the middle of Africa. I'm not going to name which nation, but what we found there was that the male and female prison population was commingled. And we went into the prisons to interview women. We heard their stories of rape and sexual violence day after day. And it was our ability to go to the First Lady with those stories and to talk in their direct language and direct quotes, which led to that particular nation on the day we left. They had built separate toilet facilities and had segregated the prison in a way that recognized, those changes. So I think, there's so many moments of impact. I just want to give you another beautiful moment of impact, and it probably comes back to the male champions of change.
Right.
A couple of years ago, I was giving a lecture to the master's class at the law at Sydney University, and I talked about, the work I was doing with the UN and also male champions of change work. And at the end of my session, when the lecturer asked whether there was any questions or comments, a young woman down the front, she put her hand up and said, "Oh, look, I don't have a question, but I do have a comment." She said, and I'm thinking, oh my God, she's going to tell me one of the male champions is not doing his part. But yes, unfortunately, that's a lived reality sometimes. But
Yeah.
she didn't. She came forward. She said, "Look, I just want you to know," she said, 3 years ago, my father became a male champion of change. She said, "and I can't tell you how everything about my life has changed."
Wow.
She said, he's interested in my career. He asks what I think about things, asks for my opinion. She said, our Christmas dinners are so much better. Our holidays are much more engaged and whatever. And she said, I put it down to the fact that he's started to understand that he has a role in helping create more gender equality in our family, but also in the nation. So it was such a heartwarming story, and it made me reflect. The fact is, male champions of change was never invented for that. It had a clear, in a sense, business purpose, but to the extent that people are whole individuals and they change, they don't just change in business, they change in the family as well. I think it comes back to your earlier point, Jack, about you're a better person because of it.
And that's so true. And it's a character and an ethical development too. And I think what you've given these leaders is a space to develop conversations or have conversations around the complexities of all of this work. Would you agree with that? That part of it is that openness and vulnerability into which you've invited them. That makes them feel they can do that.
Absolutely. And just to give you one other story from Pakistan. So I'm in Islamabad now, and I was convening a roundtable with a number of members of the media and many male members of the media. And there was one beautiful man who'd come all the way in from the Fatah region, which is on the border with Afghanistan. So it was a really disputed, dangerous region. Yeah. He ran a radio station. He was broadcasting to Taliban leaders, tribal elders. And when I said to him, look, not only that, what I learnt, Jack, was that he was including gender equality content in his broadcast. So he was telling people, please send your daughters to school. Don't beat your wife. He was running stories on transgender. I mean, he was doing amazing things. I'd say he put his life at risk every day. And I kind of jumped across the table and said, but how did the universe deliver you to us? What a gift. And he said to me, well, actually, I come from a large family. He said, I have 7 sisters and 1 brother. He said, and because we're a poor family, my parents had to make a decision about who they would send to school, so that they decided they would send my brother and I. And he said, and one day on the way to school, my brother and I, we made a pact. We decided that if we ever had any power and influence in the world, we would use it to empower women, because if we were able to do that, one day our own sisters might have a chance at an education. And it just hit me again that when we personalize these things, when they're really lodged in our hearts, that's when we'll be prepared to stand up in really difficult circumstances to advocate for change and to really drive change. And actually, his parting words to me were, he said, Liz, after all, what future do I want for my own daughter? What future do I want for the daughters of this world? It's truly beautiful.
And I mean, he's becoming a keeper of 1,000 stories too, isn't he? And I wanted to ask you about that. What's it feel like? How do you hold so many stories together personally? Like, do you ever have to take pause after one of those trips and just go, wow? And what's the responsibility you feel in this? Because I think it cannot be an easy thing to take that burden on. How do you process that amazing responsibility?
Yeah, it is a lot to hold. There's no question of that, because there's a responsibility that comes with being the keeper of these stories.
Mm.
So what I've learned over time, though, is to hold it quite gently. I mean, the fact is,
Yeah.
Jack, that there's no, if I become, you know, wedded to any given action, creating any given impact. So,
Mm.
action and impact being tightly connected. In a sense, in my world, it's so complex that is an illusion. I have to move away from being wedded to any individual result and just believe in the truth, the value, and the rightness of the work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
Because unless I do that, I'll move into smaller and smaller orbits, those orbits where I know that if I take this action, that result will happen. And that's not the world I choose to be in, or the work that I choose to do in the world, the work that's mine to do. So what I try to do then is not just at the end of any visit or, series of consultations, not just then to reflect. What I try to do is prepare in advance.
Right.
And that's through really my mindfulness practice. So I'm a regular meditator.
Oh,
And if
wow.
I'm going into a refugee camp, I will meditate morning and night.
Right.
I'll remind myself that whilst I might feel powerless to affect change, I mean, what chance do I have of convincing the European Union they need to open their borders to refugees, say, for example, coming from Greece? And I have to say, Greece has been very welcoming to refugees. But really, if I was to hold on to that, I'd be disappointed. So what I remind myself is that I have an inner life. I can feel powerful internally, because when you feel powerful, when I stand and bear witness in a particular way, I listen deeply, I engage at a level which is around shared humanity. That's when I actually will have impact as well, because power radiates, and it radiates to help others see that there is things that we can do. There is hope, even in the very difficult circumstances that we find ourselves. I think it's important to do that. So this is something that the human rights defenders have taught me, is that being well, both physically and mentally, in many nations of the world, it's the ultimate act of political defiance. And not only that, it's the ultimate act of women's empowerment. So I will be well, both physically and emotionally and mentally. And that's another reason for my meditation, for covering myself in white light, a whole variety of things like that.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful point to end on. I think that's really powerful. And Liz, what an inspiring person you are. I mean, you've been a huge influence on my own life. I think that you're an incredible leader, and the world is so much better for the work that you do. So thank you so much for coming onto this podcast. You've launched it out of the ether, but thank you, Liz. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much, Jack, and I've really loved having our conversation. It's been quite cathartic, actually. I hope the dog's growls or whatever he's chasing the bush turkey around the garden haven't interfered with the recording. So thanks so much, and good luck with the podcast. I'm really looking forward to listening to future editions of it.
Thank you so much.